Hello, everyone. Chris, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. I think there was a little bit of technical problems there just with the sound. So apologies there if you didn't hear the introduction from AIM there. My name is Henry Loewendahl, and I'll be leading the webinar with my colleague, Chris Knight. And thank you again for everyone for attending. So as you know, the webinar is about leveraging aftercare for COVID-19 recovery. Myself and Chris will go through different elements and components to this. As we go through, if you have any questions, please use the questions function on the webinar tool to ask your questions. And at the end, we'll kind of go through the questions everyone has and do our best to answer them. And during the webinar, we'll also be having some webinar polls where we can ask some information in terms of your views on different topics. And to mention then, when we do the webinar polls, all the information provided is confidential and anonymous. So please, if you can complete these questions, that'd be greatly appreciated. So we'll just kind of jump straight into it. Okay, sorry. So the first section is really what we thought would be useful, is to give just an update on the foreign direct investment market, provide some of the latest data forecasts in terms of what's happening, and of course, what's been the impact of COVID-19 on FDI and how do we see that change. Before we share some of the data data research we've been doing, it would be great if we could launch the first audience poll. The poll is asking you all, when do you expect FDI in your country to strongly recover? And there's 4 options there. If you could please select one option, that would be really appreciated. There is a, you should see yourselves the questions popping up now. And in the polls tab on the right-hand side of the screen, and then you can select an answer there and submit your vote. So if you could please do that, and then we can look at the results in a few minutes' time. Thank you. So just as you kind of complete that poll, I'll carry on going through our kind of insights in terms of what's happening in FDI. So looking at the overall picture of foreign direct investment, this graph here shows the number of greenfield foreign direct investment projects each month this year compared to the average for 2019. This data is from FDI Markets and Financial Times. It doesn't include every FDI project in the world and is focused especially on the major investments, and is a good barometer for what's happening in terms of global FDI. So what you can see there is that compared to the monthly average in 2019, that the number of foreign direct investment projects globally went down by 9% in January, 13% in February, 41% in March, and then had a really steep decline of over 60% in April and May. The most recent data for June does show that the volume of FDI is increasing again, which is good news, but it's still over 40% lower than the average last year. And when we looked into a bit more detail on the data, we saw that most of the increase is due to increased investment interest in Europe. As I'm sure you all know, Europe has come out. A lot of countries have come out of the pandemic relatively well at this stage, and within the European Union, the borders are open again, so it allows companies to do investments. So whereas for the rest of the world, the situation is still much more challenging. In terms of the forecast, we expect from now on, as restrictions gradually ease, as hopefully travel commences between countries, that the volume of FDI will slowly increase each month going towards the end of the year. Also to mention that this data is including foreign direct investment announced projects. So whilst a company may be announcing a project, they may not actually be able to implement and realize that investment until the restrictions are over in the countries they're looking to invest in. So also just to bear that in mind when you're looking at the data, this includes announced as well as actually opened investments. Just finally, in terms of what we're projecting for next year, for the Q1 next year, we're expecting the volume of FDI to be around 20% lower than 2019 as the recovery begins properly. Okay, so looking at what are the key reasons why foreign direct investment market collapsed, especially a few months ago. So there's probably three main reasons which we can identify. So first of all, travel restrictions, obviously really critical for FDI. Companies couldn't do site visits, couldn't do due diligence of locations. They couldn't complete all the contracts and administrative procedures to invest in most places in the world. So that made FDI extremely challenging and still does in many countries. The lockdown prevented recruiting a workforce, building and outfitting of sites and properties, and securing supply chains as well. So that also had a really negative impact on FDI. And then, of course, we've had an unprecedented economic recession, which reduced the business case for investment as demand has collapsed around the world. So it's the combination of those three factors which really led to the huge decline. And if we compare to previous kind of global economic recessions, you really were just faced with the third factor, not to the same extent as today, not the first two factors. So that's why FDI has really gone down so much. Okay. This does paint quite a negative picture, but there is a silver lining here in that looking across different sectors, and we've done quite a lot of research on each industry, many industries have not cancelled their FDI plans yet. What companies are doing is putting on hold the timing of their investments, and the size of investments is also being reduced as demand has gone down. But the actual intention to invest is still there, which is the most positive aspect. Also, many sectors have actually proved resilient, and even some sectors have continued to grow during the crisis. Of course, the life sciences sector, given the demand for healthcare, has continued to grow and continue to invest, and Chris will be talking a bit more about that. And also in certain technology sectors and logistics-related sectors, we've seen a growth in demand and a growth in investment. So there are opportunities despite the overall FDI going down. And of course, there's a lot of talk about the relocation of production more evenly distributed around the world, and supply chain reshoring to certain markets, which will also increase FDI. And finally, what we're seeing around the world is government economic stimulation packages on a pretty huge scale, which will stimulate investment. And in certain regions of the world, for example, in Africa, we see a greater focus on regional integration, which will increase the attractiveness for foreign direct investment. So whilst the situation has been pretty terrible in terms of FDI in the last month since the pandemic, we see a slow recovery, and then longer term, we do still see very positive drivers for FDI. Okay, if you look at the investment plans for data, some investor surveys have been conducted already in the last month. So this is one survey in the US looking at the plans of companies to resume their investment in the US. And you can see there that companies are not really planning any new investment until after September this year. And then you can see in the last quarter of this year, and then during 2021, companies are planning to resume their foreign direct investment, or not foreign direct investment, but their investment in the US. And we actually did another recent webinar with Dubai Airport Free Zone Authority, or DAFSA, focusing on companies and investors last month. And we asked companies about their investment plans for the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. And you can see the results there. So you can see that nearly 10% of companies were planning to resume their FDI, in this big region of the world, Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, by the end of or in the second half of this year. And then from the end of this year to the first half of 2021, you can see another third of companies are planning to resume their investments. So over 40% of companies are planning to resume their FDI within the year. So I think this is a really important message, both the US investor survey and the survey looking at companies looking at this region, is that companies are planning to resume their FDI towards the end of this year and certainly next year. And we also looked at the latest data, just looking at May and June, again from FDI Markets and Financial Times, looking at the future FDI plans of companies. And this graph shows the percentage of companies in May and June looking to invest in each region of the world in terms of FDI. And it compares it with the percentages in 2019. And we actually did a similar analysis a couple of months ago, where we looked just at February and March. And even since then, we've seen quite a big shift. So what we can see is that companies are especially more focused on Western Europe and emerging Europe regions. And that's because, as I mentioned before, those regions are opening up again. You know, they were amongst the first to be hit by the pandemic and have controlled it in a lot of countries in Europe. And therefore, FDI flows are coming back strongly, or FDI plans are coming back strongly in Europe. And then you can see in other regions of the world, in most regions, there's been a slight decline in investor interest. So what the graph really shows is that your FDI prospects and the likelihood to get companies looking again at FDI in your country or in your regions is very closely linked to how you control the pandemic, and also in terms of how your country opens up again for business and for work, and also in terms of the flight routes, so the opening up, the reducing of travel restrictions, so investors can come to your country and start investing again. I mean, those are all going to be key criteria to determining, you know, when FDI can resume in your location. Okay, just go to the next slide. Sorry, I'm not sure if I missed something there. No, okay. Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to hand over to Chris now to look at the next section.
Okay, thanks, Henry. So Henry's already started talking about how there are FDI opportunities out there, how companies are looking at their longer term plans, whether that be 6 months to a year. But in all reality, we know there cannot be much FDI at this time due to the no flights, not being able to visit, and second wave cases coming up. So now we're going to take a little look at the importance of existing investors to your location. So again, before we kick off, it would be good if you could again go to your polls and answer the question. So in 2020, what percentage of FDI in your location do you expect to be from existing investors? So we'll come back to that in a second, and I guess we'll come back to Henry's question and the first poll too. So according to UNTAD, in a typical year, so this is in 2018, 61% of FDI flows in developed economies and 40% in developing were reinvested earnings, so expansions. But this year it's going to be completely different, and I expect that number is going to be much, much higher. So what we've done is we've decided just to take an initial look at a couple of industries and what that means. And if we look at this chart, what it's showing you is the percentage of new jobs created by expansions within medical devices and life sciences over the years. Okay, so I think this is really interesting to see. If you take a look at 2020, medical device jobs account for 72% of any new job in a location. This is over 30% higher than any other time going back to 2012. So it's key to be knowing who these investors are, engaging with them, talking about the opportunities for expansion within your location, and not always just worrying about the new investor. Similarly, if we look at overall life sciences, it's at 46.2%, which is about 11% higher than any other year. So I would be looking at some of these growth sectors, which Henry has talked about, and then looking at which ones are growing in terms of expansions, and making sure, as for any of the IPAs on the call, making sure you're engaged with these companies so that you're front and center of their minds when they're deciding where they need to expand. They've got a lot of locations around the world, so they need to decide on which of these they want to expand. So it's going to be important to be engaging with them. So if we just look at the polls and see where we are. So I can see from Henry's, and Henry, I'll throw it out to you to discuss it, but when do you expect FDI in your country to strongly recover? 39% of people are saying in the first half of next year, 32% are saying the second half of next year, 16% saying it won't recover till 2022, and 13% think before the end of this year. So that's where our stats are in that one. And if we take a look at what percentage of FDI in your location do you expect to be from existing investors? So the majority are saying 25 to 50, but we do have 23% are thinking that over 75% of their investment this year will be from expansions. So that really, I think, sets the scene well for everything we're about to talk about in terms of the importance of aftercare. And not only aftercare, but looking at investor development and developing investors so that they are going to choose your location to create more jobs. So I'm going to pass back to Henry, who's going to kick us off looking at what is aftercare before we take a look at some things which are happening.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. And thanks everyone for doing the polls there. Okay, so first of all, what is aftercare? So we can kind of see it as a process. So first of all, your investment promotion teams or business development teams do a great job and bring an investor to the stage where they've announced their investment in your location. Typically what happens then in most locations around the world is that the investment facilitation or services team in an investment promotion agency takes over, and then they support the companies implement and operationalize their projects. And right now with the pandemic, that's the big road barrier right now to making investments. Once the company has established their investment, so it's operationalized, that's when real aftercare kicks in, and you can see that highlighted in the red box. So there's really two main components to aftercare. So first of all is your general support to existing investors around helping them solve any problems and issues they have with their operations, and if the company's looking to expand their operations, helping them with that expansion. And that's kind of typically what most investment promotion organizations around the world are doing. But there is another type of aftercare, which we call investor development. And that's where you provide more strategic services to embed selected investors into your economy. And we'll be going on into a bit more detail in terms of both of those two components to aftercare. And sorry, just to mention there as well, the fourth component, which we're not going to look at today, but would be where you actually work with your existing investors, get feedback from them in terms of any policy changes which the government can make to improve the competitiveness of the location for investment for both FDI and for domestic investors. And that's kind of what we call policy advocacy. In terms of the most effective techniques to attract FDI, aftercare becomes even more important in terms of why you should be doing it. So this was a survey which we did with Financial Times FDI Intelligence Division of IPAs to ask IPAs around the world, what are the most effective, and we did this before the pandemic to mention as well, what are the most effective techniques to attract FDI? We asked which agencies are using each technique, how would they score it from 0 to 5, with 5 the most effective. And also we've done a bit of analysis just to see how we expect this technique to change in importance with COVID-19. As you can see, that aftercare services for existing firms was rated the most important technique to attract FDI. One reason, of course, is as Chris showed, that existing investment accounts for a high percentage of total investment in your economy, and with the pandemic, as Chris showed, in certain sectors that percentage is now over 70%, which actually is quite common. In previous kind of financial and global economic crisis, we see the percentage of existing investment going up to about the 70% figure in many countries around the world. But aftercare is not just important because existing investment accounts for big percentages of FDI, and work with your existing investors can have lots of other spillover benefits. For example, it can help you build supply chains in your location. You can use your existing investors as what we call investment ambassadors, so they can actually help promote your location to other new investors. And as well, as we say in private sector sales, it's much easier to sell a new product to an existing customer than a new product to a new customer. So your existing investors, they're already in your country or in your region, and it's much easier for you to engage with them. They understand your location, and then it's much easier for you to engage with those companies to help do more investment projects in your region. Also, just to mention there that we do see aftercare becoming far more important as a result of the pandemic. You can see that we have big increase in likely importance. Also, just to mention there, having sales representatives overseas or outsourcing your lead generation to consulting firms, such as Wavteq and other companies, was rated as the second and third most important techniques to attract investment. And we also expect that those techniques will become more effective and more important as a result of the pandemic. I'm just mentioning that now because later on in the presentation, we'll explain why having sales representatives overseas has become more important as a result of the pandemic. In terms of how much resources are IPAs around the world putting into aftercare, the OECD did a study looking at OECD IPAs, so looking at those in the industrialized countries, looking at what % of their budget and what % of their personnel was invested in different types of investment promotion activity. And you can see there that only 30% of budget went into investment facilitation, retention, and aftercare. So that's including the facilitation services as well as aftercare. The actual percentage on facilitation, based on our own research, is probably closer to around 15% or 10 to 15% of budget going into actual proper aftercare. So it's a relatively low percentage of budget and personnel actually going into aftercare relative to the importance of aftercare and existing investors in your total investment, and based on the survey evidence we just showed, how IPAs rate aftercare as an investment attraction activity. So overall, we do think that IPAs, and this is some data behind that, have historically underinvested in their aftercare services, and that has meant that many countries and IPAs around the world were not as prepared for this pandemic as well as they could have been if they had been investing more in aftercare. Okay, so I'm going to hand over again to Chris now.
Okay, so what we'll look at now is some of the best practices in aftercare and what some IPAs around the world are doing. And we've shaped this really looking at during the COVID time. So it is going to be more geared towards what can be done now. The key question to ask yourself before even thinking about what to do is, what do you currently do? How does your IPA engage with your existing investors to help solve any problems and to help them reinvest with new projects? So, before coming up with your aftercare strategy, it's worth thinking about how you're already engaging with investors, how you can improve that, and then look to add in some new techniques. So I'm going to show you a variety. I don't think you need to do all of the 10 or 11, but you should be picking and choosing some of these to start adopting. So the first one is pretty key. Make your website the go-to for your businesses, your local businesses. I've seen a lot of IPAs, EDOs around the world create a new tab on their website with COVID updates. Not only is this good for giving them the information, it's good for driving traffic to your website, letting them find out more which you do as an IPA, maybe different things that they can benefit from, and really allowing you to engage better with them. Social media. Well, nowadays, with COVID, it's a pretty fluid situation, right? So you need to be getting this information out to the world or to your investors as quick as possible. There's no quicker way than using social media. So I particularly think between Twitter and LinkedIn, keeping people updated on latest policies and latest possible incentives is key to be doing that on social media. Next, you've got e-newsletters. So I've seen these done very well in terms of engaging with your current investors. One of the big benefits are the investors have opted in to receive these newsletters. So your engagement rates are much higher than sending out blanket emails. These are people who want to know about your updates and want to see these newsletters. So in times of COVID, it's great, you can keep people updated, but after that, you will still have these people who are engaged with you, and you'll be able to sell ideas, send new information, and keep them fully updated on what you do. Alternatively, you can do emails. The challenge with that is if you don't have a database of the investors and all of their details, it's going to be really difficult to send out these emails. And then are you going to tailor them or do a generic email? A lot of generic emails nowadays go straight to trash. And then you have to think of different data protection regulations around the world before you start doing that. So it's worth having a think about your email campaigns. I think when you look at your most important or your key investors, and that doesn't have to be by size, it can be to do with who's most embedded in the community. I think it's important to do some virtual meetings, face-to-face, or as face-to-face as you can, to discuss, the risks and the opportunities there are. maybe there's opportunities to grow, maybe they're considering leaving, and you need to find out what this risk and opportunities are. I think having focus groups or webinars with existing investors is a good way to engage with a higher number of companies at one time. You also can do like we're doing, do poll questions to find out, what investor sentiments are, some issues they're currently having. Then I think you can have an open Q&A. So for example, I was doing webinars last week to all IPAs throughout Africa, and we all brought on our cameras. I think there's about 90 of us, and it was just a live Q&A talking about issues going on in countries and things we can do to overcome these. And it is a good way to engage in what you would typically do, a focus group, but just making that virtual. Then you've got professional service firms. So this is your accountants, your legal firms, real estate advisors, incentives advisors. These guys are probably the first people companies go to when they're having issues to find out what can be done. So for example, accountants, if you keep accountants up to date with any new funding available for companies, they can share that with the investors. So it's a good way for you to get your message out to many investors who maybe you don't have those relationships with. And particularly for big countries, if you look at number 7, looking at chambers of commerce. So these are memberships. Companies are all members of these chambers. And so they'll be able to know what issues there are with companies within their membership, what the IPA can be doing to help through this. So if you're able to feed your information and keep chambers up to date with anything new going on in the community, this will be a good way to engage with many more companies. Again, for those countries which have local and regional economic development agencies, I think it's important to coordinate your approach to aftercare or investor development to make sure you don't have like 6 people contacting the same person. Have it coordinated. Often people who are local are more likely to be closer engaged with the company. So make sure you're working with your regional development organizations. I think it's really important, particularly if you're using your embassies and you have an overseas office, to use them to interact at headquarter level. So a lot of decisions of companies are made from HQ. So if you're able to engage at both the local and the international HQ level, you're more likely to be successful. And we'll touch on that. And then finally, we're even finding is using consulting firms or outsourcing. So if you don't have people in key source markets, we have had many locations who have outsourced it where we engage in their behalf. That can also work locally. If you're wanting to run an investor survey, sometimes answers are more open when it's to a third party, and you can find out really what companies are thinking. So I think you'll never do all 10 of these. If you're going to adopt 1 or 2, maybe 3 of these, I think it would really help your engagement with companies. So a few case studies of what some IPAs have been doing. So if we look at Quinte Economic Development Commission in Canada, they were one of the first IPAs we've seen that launched their resource portal for COVID-19 for their local businesses. And they've tracked it through to see what's happened with doing that. And through their aftercare, they've secured a $20 million investment related to COVID. So again, being the quickest to do that when businesses needed help, this is why we picked this example. You then have some other best practices which the WIPA announced. So you've got Scottish Development. They've created a dedicated call center for all the local businesses to engage with. EDOs Lebanon have got free online legal and audit advisors. So again, key, people are going to their legal advisors. So building that network and relationships with all of the advisors becomes important. Westgrow, I think they've been very good throughout all of this. They've got a portal on their website. They've also got a support finder portal. In fact, they're moving to virtual trade missions, virtual aftercare. So again, pretty ahead of the times. FIPA Tunisia, they have got a 7-day-a-week support for investors. So this is key, and this is coordinated across all of government. So investors are always getting the same message going back, and they can tap into this resource 7 days a week. You then have Invest India, and I recommend you take a look at this. They've created a business immunity platform. So, you can go on and get live news updates and find out about their latest policies which are in place. And it's got all of their social media live, so you can pick out on that. It then even has a regional breakdown. So you can choose any province of India, click on it, and it will tell you what support is available, as well as the number of cases. There's a live dashboard, which is showing an update on how they're performing in terms of cases, intensive care unit, things like that. So those are a few examples. But I think it's important when we chat about aftercare, is it done by marketing or is it proactive and done by an aftercare team? Our advice is it's a bit of both. When you're looking at it in terms of marketing, I think this is where IPAs have probably performed stronger in getting the message out there in social media, getting newsletters out there, doing maybe some webinars. I think it's pretty good in terms of the approach that's been taken to inform the businesses. Where I think it can be improved is becoming more strategic and moving it from aftercare to investor development. And I would say very few IPAs or EDOs are doing this successfully. And one of the challenges I know we have identified at Wavteq is quite a lot of IPAs around the world do not have a list of all the investors and contacts within this company. They don't have this on the CRM. So it's really hard to be proactive, do one-on-one calls if you don't know who you're meant to be communicating with. So a big piece of advice we have is you need to start getting this, because if there's going to be any more crisis in the world, you're going to need it again and again. So adopt your CRM to have an aftercare section, to have all the companies in your community so you can engage with them. We think it's at this time that you need to invest a bit more money into your aftercare. Typically, I get the question, yeah, but how do we do that on a budget? Well, I would say take some of the budget you had earmarked for travel, and this year put some of that you would have spent on trade shows into your aftercare strategy and into trying some of these new techniques, getting a list of your investors, creating a CRM to have them all in so you can start engaging with them. Then it's a matter of evaluating how you're doing. With investor development, you can set targets, but it's just about making sure you're consistently engaging. And this isn't just during the pandemic. I would be bringing this strategy into your overall work. So each year you're going to be engaging with these investors. So who do we engage with? Well, we think, and there is a caveat to this. This depends on the size of your country or your organization. But if you're a large country, we think that there are 3 different engagement types. One, you engage with the general management in the local subsidiary. So in the local community or city, you would engage at that level. But it is also worth engaging at national level, because the country HQ are maybe working on the national level strategy, looking at which parts are going to grow throughout the year within the country. But then it's also very important to engage at national HQ level, because this is where the global strategy is led from, and this is where you need to have good engagements at the top, because, when not every location will expand, and at HQ, that's where they'll be deciding where to put their resources. So they need to know about your location and about what your offering is.
Chris is coming with an example there.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so just to give maybe a real life case study. So we're working right now with a major state in the US to help them implement their aftercare program. And so what we're doing, especially with Asian investors in that state, our teams in each country in Asia are engaging with the global headquarters of that company to understand what does their current FDI strategy look like, what are their current and future plans for the US, and do they have any concerns, issues, risks, or opportunities with their current subsidiary in the state we're working with. So it's kind of looking as well as at investment retention. So we're trying to retain the existing investors, also see if there's any expansion opportunities. As well as it's also really important to kind of show the global headquarters of the company, that the state economic development organization really wants to engage with them and support them, going through this crisis. And I mean, what we found, just related to what Chris's point is that who you need to speak to in the foreign investor varies company by company. So we have some cases of a large Asian company with a large subsidiary, and they said their operations in the US are so big, their country headquarters in the US has the main decision making for investment decisions. So that is better for us to speak with the US HQ, which is, I guess, the second box there in Chris's diagram. For other companies, they don't have a country headquarters or regional headquarters, or that headquarters only has limited decision making, and it's back in the Asian and global headquarters where decisions are made. And through that process of speaking with their existing investors at the global headquarters, we have identified companies which were or are considering closing the operation, and been able to put them in touch with the IPA or Economic Development Agency, as they're called in the US, to try and do everything they can to keep the operation open. And we've also identified companies which actually are looking to expand, and we've been able to put them in contact with the Economic Development Agency to help with that expansion project. So that's just an example of how this approach works. And if you're not able to engage with the regional or global headquarters of a major existing investor, then that's going to be probably a weakness in your overall aftercare program.
Thanks, Henry. We're just going to jump to one more poll now, and it's just to see who you are currently engaging with. So who in your existing investors do you have strong relations with? If you could just, again, answer that poll, and then Henry will go to the results of that in a couple of minutes. Okay, so what happens when you're not fully engaging with foreign investors? We believe that the results in not engaging is there's lack of awareness of what your IP does at HQ level. So if you're not speaking to them at the source country, they're not going to know about every single country in the world, and you cannot assume that the HQ knows everywhere and knows the benefits and the drawbacks of every country. So you need to build up those relations. You need to keep the corporate HQ updated on key policies. Again, if you can get them in your mailing list, if you can have FaceTime with them to keep them up to date, it's definitely going to keep you front and center of their mind if there are any opportunities. And number 3 is probably more obvious. If you're not doing it, someone else is probably doing it better. And your competitors will be a step ahead of you, and they'll be front when they're going to be looking at where to go. So you need to really work on that. And let's be honest, other locations will be pitching for the investor to leave your country and go to theirs. So you need to build these relationships. You'll also, if you don't have relations at the top, it will be very difficult to develop this investor to be a larger investor in your community. And I think a lot of IPAs and what we touch on, they rely on a fly-in, fly-out model. And what that means is, we'll go to China once a year. We'll meet our companies and we'll expect them all to follow us back and set up. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. The relationships have to be persistent. You have to maintain them, regularly engage with them, and face-to-face is going to be important. It's shown us during this pandemic, even if we look at our own business, how important having in-market people are, because now we can't travel. There is no face-to-face meetings. But if you have an office already in one of these overseas markets, the countries are able to travel within the country so they can have face-to-face meetings. So if you have your own office in China, the chances is you're going to be more successful than a location who has no one there and has to wait until flight routes are open up again. So, not only for aftercare is this important, but also new business development, this is going to be key. To be able to get these new leads, I'm not sure how people on the phone have been finding it, but it's often more difficult to nurture a lead just doing Zoom calls. I think you can get to a certain level of interest, but it's still going to stall until there can be face-to-face visits or discussions. So just pass back to Henry now.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, just for time reasons, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly so we have time for questions. And thanks everybody for posting all your questions, which are really interesting. So as mentioned at the beginning, there's two types of aftercare. One, is your general support and problem solving, helping with expansion projects to investors. And secondly is the deeper, more strategic services, which we call investor development. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of those services. So when we talk about investor development, what we're really talking about is how you can embed foreign investors into your local current economy, so that if there is a global crisis like now, it's much harder for them to disinvest, and so they can contribute more to your regional country, as well as encourage them to actually upgrade their operations to higher value added activities, which should be the prime economic development objective around the world. If we look at the kind of services which are typically provided by IPAs who have developed an investor development program, and just to mention to everyone, I actually did my PhD, looking at investor development, being based in the IPA, which developed the first investor development program in the world. So this is something which I've had, really keen interest in for many years. And if you look at the services which are provided, I think the main service which I've seen around the world, and I also did my own kind of doctoral research on, was the supply chain development. In that, by working strategically with major investors, which you've carefully selected, helping to link them to local companies, or attract their foreign suppliers into your economy, you can massively increase the impact of FDI. I mean, the World Bank and other studies have shown the supply chain impact can be up to 3 times the value of the existing FDI. So you can triple the value of the investment to your economy, and that's how important it is. And then actually my own research has shown that companies that IPAs which have been able to develop supply chain development programs and implement them, and attract more of the supply chain locally, when there is a rationalization of the company's operations, which we're seeing around the world right now, their location is far less at risk because the company has its supply chain in your location. So therefore, it's much harder for them to close down. And that's what we mean by embedding of foreign investors into your local economy. So you can't really overemphasize the importance of this, and I think with the pandemic, everybody has really seen that loud and clear, the importance of supply chains. Secondly, is skills and training. Working with your existing investors and local training organizations to ensure that you have the right skills and education and training which investors actually need. That's critical to investors in so many sectors, and that will allow them to expand their operations in your location and allow them to upgrade to higher productivity activities and increase the wealth of your economy. Thirdly, technology upgrading and R&D, so encouraging investors to do linkages with local R&D institutes to upgrade their technology level of their operations. That can actually include things like Industry 4.0, helping your existing investors, or encouraging them to adopt robotics and other technologies which can increase the productivity and competitiveness of the operations. Fourthly is export development. Now, in quite a lot of government departments, the export and the FDI services are separated, even separate organizations in many countries, or separate divisions. What you can do is ensure that the foreign investors get the same support as local companies do for developing their overseas market penetration and exports. And then finally, and this is something we're seeing much more recently, is sustainable development goals. Is how can you encourage your existing investors to have industry standards in CSR, corporate and social responsibility, to have them meet industry standards in economic, social, and environmental sustainability. This has become more important than ever before. And by encouraging your foreign investors to meet these standards, they're going to contribute much more to the local economy and especially to the local community as well, and support your overall sustainable SDGs, or sustainable development goals of the country. So this is an area which we think is also very important to consider as part of your investor development. Okay, so I think this may be the final poll. If you could just bring up the poll questions, please. This is asking you to select which investor development services are you currently providing. So you can see the options there. There's 8 options. If you could just go through and select the ones which you're currently doing if you're an investment promotion organization. I'll look at the poll results as they come in a bit later. Okay, so how do you actually set up an investor development program? So the starting point generally is to have a dedicated aftercare department. So that's the starting point. To develop investor development, best practice is that you best practice is that you organize your aftercare department into clear sector teams, focusing on the sectors which have the best potential for broader economic impact, or especially in today's environment, have a high risk of closure, but are very important for your country or your regional community. Focusing your investor development strategy on the existing and foreign investors who have the best potential for more investment and for supply chains and other investor development benefits, all which are at risk. Identified who are the highest priority investors you want to work with. Very important is to do your research on each investor. Understand what they're doing currently in your location, but also understand what is the strategy, what does the global operations look like of the parent company, so you know how you can fit into the value chains of that company. For example, if you see the company has a sales office in your location, or a headquarters, or logistics center, but has no manufacturing, and you do a profile and you see they have no manufacturing, in fact, in the entire region which your country is located within, but they have manufacturing in other regions of the world, especially with today, with the pandemic, with companies looking to lower the risk of their supply chains and spread out their supply chains more evenly around the world. This is really critical analysis to do, because it enables you to see where there could be opportunities. And that's really the point about investor development, is proactive. You're making a plan for each investor. Now, the investor may not be willing necessarily to collaborate with that plan, but your objective is to develop a plan for what do you think that investor could do potentially in your economy. Could it attract its suppliers to invest? Could it create supply chain linkage with local companies? Could it partner with training institutions to develop further skills or R&D? Could it relocate other parts of its value chain or supply chain to your location? And then you need an engagement strategy. How are you going to engage with those existing investors, both at the subsidiary level and international level? How are you going to monitor and evaluate the program? And what are the key performance indicators? The key performance indicators may be different to your typical IPA targets. Your IPA targets may be to attract, $200 million of investment, or to create 10,000 jobs. They're generally around, or to attract 50 projects. But here your metrics may be different. It may be to create 10 supplier agreements with local companies, generating $10 million in extra income for your local suppliers. It could be to develop 2 R&D linkage programs or 2 skills programs. So you need to think about how the metrics which evaluate the performance of your IPA or organization needs to change as you move into investor development, because it does need to change. Ideally, in your sector teams, you would have a senior sector specialist, ideally someone with industry experience who can lead the investor development. We're talking about a relatively low number of companies for each specialist. It could be just between 5 to 20 companies, typically, is what we've seen. So you're focusing on quality, not quantity, in terms of rolling out the investor development program. Also, what we see often happens is that the aftercare teams engage with the companies, but they don't bring in very senior members of your senior management from your IPA to give that kind of credibility and commitment. So it's important to involve your senior management, especially when you're meeting major investors. Don't just leave it to more junior staff. Even though they might be leading the program, you kind of want the senior management to show their face, to show their commitment. And of course, involve the corporate headquarters in the decision as well. So I'm just going to see now if we can see some poll results yet. I realize I have to do it myself. So, okay. So we're looking at the poll results. I can see that 45% of respondents said they're working with the foreign investors to attract more of the suppliers to their location, which is the highest number. So that's really positive. So nearly half of the IPAs participating say they're trying to attract more suppliers to their location. 16% are working on supply chain linkage programs to matchmake local suppliers. Now that's a fairly low percentage, and that's definitely, I think, an area which a lot more resource could be put into. 12% are working on raising the capabilities of local suppliers, and then the rest of it is very low. Only 6% skills and training, only 3% for technology upgrading, 9% for connecting foreign investors to R&D institutes, and 9% for encouraging foreign investors to implement more sustainable development programs. So those are all very low currently, and are all areas which we think IBA should be looking more at if they can get the resources for that. Okay, here's just a case study. It's a great one to look at. We recommend you go onto their website, check invest. So my PhD was looking at the region of northeastern England, and they actually advised then and went and seconded the staff into check invest to set up their investor development program. So as a result, and because of all the progress they've made, it's absolutely one of the best in the world right now. And they have resources such as online supplier databases to help foreign investors link up with suppliers. There's a lot of innovative activities they're doing. Also, their COVID-19 response plan and support is excellent. So it's also one to look at for that reason. And a lot of information is available on your website, which you can look at. Okay, and finally, we're not really going to go into this now because we don't want to do a big sales pitch for the company. But when we send the presentation, we do outline the kind of services and system solutions and databases and so on, which Wavteq does offer, which can help you, develop and implement your aftercare program. So I'm just going to skip over that. You'll see that when you download the presentation, which is all available on the AIM website. So, I mean, on behalf of Chris and I and AIM, thank you very much for listening to the webinar, and most of all, keep healthy, keep safe, and support your existing investors. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Henry. I'm just gonna, we only have 5 to 10 minutes left, so pull out a few of the most popular questions. I'll throw them over to you, and then I can add it if needed. So the top one, in terms of 9 people voted for this one, is if there is to be a second wave, how do you think investments are going to look? Like you're compared to the predictions you had at the beginning?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer. It just depends on the extent of the second wave. It depends on whether restrictions, whether that's working restrictions or travel restrictions are reimposed again. I mean, I think we can probably look at the US right now, where the first wave or second wave, I don't know which it is really developing so strongly there, and look at what impacts that's having on investors as an example. And I think we look at the US, and we're working with many states in the US, helping them attract FDI, to have quite some knowledge of what the investors are thinking. Investors, have not cancelled their plans to invest in the US. I mean, they're still looking at FDI in the US, perhaps even more so as a result of the pandemic, because because of the cost base in the US, so many companies had invested in other countries, including US companies, in particular in Asia, but other regions of the world as well, like Mexico, other countries, to export to the US rather than actually do the FDI in the US. And so now there is a huge pressure, and that pressure is reinforced by trade barriers being imposed. It's likely to be reinforced by a massive US federal government subsidy program, which is being discussed to incentivize companies to relocate. So we actually expect the FDI interest in the US to quite dramatically increase, in fact, rather than decrease. The issue with the scale of the pandemic there is that it's very difficult for companies to actually make that investment. So whilst the intentions are there to invest even bigger than before, they can't realize the investments, and I think that's going to be the problem if there are second waves. Right now, what we're seeing in Europe with the opening up again is that companies are being able to start implementing their projects again, and in other countries. I mean, there are some good examples, like Tunisia, Morocco, New Zealand, Australia, other countries which have controlled the pandemic very well. And in the case of some of those countries, like in North Africa, the borders have opened with the EU. The EU is now going to permit travel to those countries, and that's going to allow investment to start again. If there is a second wave, it's likely to be postponed. So it's just likely to delay when you can actually realize that investment.
I think that goes with what we were told yesterday when we were speaking to the US, that a lot of them don't expect there to be any international flights this year. So they're really looking at the long-term game, and they're looking about how they can continue to keep these investors interested when they can't make that move.
Yeah.
So the next question, Henry, is, will the recent reshoring, nearshoring movements, which have gained speed due to the pandemic, with companies leaving China, so it looks like it's a good opportunity for those located nearby. But what about other locations which are further away? What's the opportunity there for the nearshoring?
Yeah, well, I mean, we need to really kind of analyze it in a bit more detail, because the initial relocations from China were starting before the pandemic due to US trade barriers, and risks of future trade barriers, and that led to a whole wave. We're talking maybe up to 100 companies relocating from China to Southeast Asia, as mentioned in that comment there, and even we're working with the Indonesian government on investment attraction as part of a long-term program, and in Indonesia this week. There was, I think, around 6 more Chinese investments, and investors from China, about $850 million, announced relocations to Indonesia, and that's especially in manufacturing, electronics, those kind of sectors. The question there in terms of what about countries further away, I think it depends on two things. I mean, ignoring the pandemic, it depends on 2 things. One, what is your competitive advantage in those industries which are ripe for relocation? Can you compete with Southeast Asia, Vietnam most of all, but also the likes of Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia, other countries in that region? What's your competitive advantage? And secondly, what are your trade, what do your kind of free trade agreements look like with the countries which those companies are relocating to export to? That's going to be critical as well. What are your trade agreements, with the US, with Europe in particular, as the 2 of the world's biggest markets? With the pandemic, there's a whole other set of criteria around, how you're controlling the pandemic, and have flights and travel opened up again. But I think there is definitely potential. We already saw with the first wave of relocation from China, that actually Mexico was the first beneficiary, and then because of kind of political reasons as well, pressures, and companies also started looking much more Southeast Asia for relocation, especially in different industries which Mexico was less competitive in particular, maybe lower cost textiles industries and electronics, and so that shows there are opportunities. So I think you've just got to look at the sectors. You've got to look at how competitive you are. You've got to look at, do you have the access to the export markets?
Yeah. One of the questions which I answered on the chat was, are we going to answer the questions we don't have time for? Because there is quite a lot. So if anyone wants it, you can email myself or Henry, and we'll ensure you get a response to your question. The next one, I guess I'll take a slight go at, but it's, has there been any research or conversation discussing a decline in companies seeking to expand or set up a second office due to remote work? Well, I don't know if there's been a lot of research, but I can tell you on Wavteq's experience, as a small company, this is definitely important for us. We're looking at going to a smaller office, because with new rules, you're going to have to socially distanced offices. You might need PPE equipment. You need to clean the office. They told us 4 times a day. You need to have sanitizers, and small companies simply cannot afford this. So I believe, and this is only my thoughts, a lot of smaller companies will look more to go to shared service offices where others are looking after and making sure it is health and safety checked for COVID. And I think there will also be a big shift in terms of number of people working full time in offices. I think there will be like part teams going in different days. So the size and requirements of office space might be different following this. But again, I haven't read any research. This is just from the few companies I've spoken to and ourselves. Do you have any comments on that one, Henry?
No, I think you're right, Chris. I mean, there was another question which I thought was interesting, especially as we have a lot of experience in it. I think actually there was some good questions, several good questions by the same person. So one question was, how effective is outsourcing? Do they prioritize certain communities over others and investment opportunities? And how can you ensure your community is given priority? So, I mean, in terms of outsourcing, that's the main part of our business, where we work with IPAs to help them attract investment, whether that's new or existing. When you're looking at that as an option, what's really important is to understand the level of exclusivity, especially if you're looking at a longer term engagement with a consulting firm. So, are they working with any of your competitors? Are they targeting the same sectors as the sectors you're targeting? And if that's the case, how are they going to manage that conflict of interest? I mean, generally in our case, we try to avoid all conflict of interest, in the sense that if we're working on a long-term engagement with an IPA in a particular region, we won't work with their competitor regions over that same in those same sectors they're targeting, and over the course of that contract, that ensures you have 100% priority in terms of where do the investment opportunities go to. So I think that's something which you need to look very, very closely at. And I mean, there's a few other points as well, relating to how you manage outsourcing if you are going to use consultants. Especially be focused on the particular sectors which they're going to be targeting, whether they're going to be looking at just new investment or existing investment. How is the consultant going to hand over opportunities to you? At what stage do you get involved in that process? And really just making sure you have a genuine strong value proposition and competitive position to attract investment from that country and in that sector. And just the other question from the same person also is very interesting. Something we're looking at is how should an IPA or FDI departments partner with the kind of BRE, business retention and expansion teams in the community for local investment, and what should we do with the decline in investment attraction opportunities? So I think there's several dimensions to that. I mean, I think for larger countries, it is having that level of coordination at the local level is critical, and that can be very challenging, especially in federal countries where there's a lot of autonomy at the regional level. So you kind of really want to do everything you can to try and facilitate and empower kind of the coordination between the local level and the national level, because at the national or federal level you're going to have much more credibility with investors, and be able to engage with them, especially with their regional headquarters or global headquarters. So that coordination element is very important. And just finally, in terms of the domestic investment, because the FDI market has been so challenging now, it's very hard to attract FDI until everything opens up again. Yes, definitely there is much more potential or much more importance now working with your domestic investors than foreign investors. But at the same time, it's that linkage which is important. I mean, a lot of foreign investors now, it may be difficult for them to do a greenfield FDI project, but they can definitely do a JV, or a local subcontracting arrangement or outsourcing contract with a local company, or even a merger and acquisition. So having working with your existing domestic investors will also enable you to exploit and drive much more of those linkages between foreign investors.
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. So, just to echo Henry, thank you to Ian for putting this together. We're always happy to be involved in these, and thanks for everyone for attending and sharing your questions. So we'll pass it back to Ian, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Yes, we apologize for internet connection discrepancy during the introduction of the webinar, but thank you, Mr. Henry and Mr. Chris, for covering it up very well. And thank you also very much for your time and for such an interesting webinar. There's a lot for us to take back on what aftercare means and the best practices in aftercare. I would like to thank once again our multilateral partner, Islamic Corporation, for the development of the private sector for sponsoring today's webinar. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us and sharing their questions. The link to today's webinar's video and presentation will be sent to you via email. We're also conducting a short survey to get your feedback on today's webinar. The link to the survey will be shared via chat and via email. And to register for our next webinar scheduled for the 9th of July 2020, please visit our website, www.incongress.com/webinars. Also follow us on our social media channels to keep yourself updated. Thank you all once again, and we look forward to seeing you on the 9th of July.